How's it going, everyone? It's Harvey from Weather Sponge 5000, and I hope you guys are having a great day. As of course, we're going to talk about newly stormed Tropical Storm Tammy that's now approaching the Leeward Islands and is expected to make landfall right over one of the Leeward Islands, where you could experience major impacts when it comes to wind, heavy rainfall, as well as coastal flooding in the more localized areas. But take a look at the overall composition of Tropical Storm Tammy right now. It has maximum sustained winds at around 40 miles per hour, with its millibar pressure hovering around 1,000 millibars, and it's moving west at 23 miles per hour, which is relatively fast for a tropical cyclone moving through the main development region. And this is due to the fact that the westerly winds are quite strong thanks to a ridge just to the north of it, which in part thankfully should help at least put a cap when it comes to intensification of this storm system, because the center circulation along the surface is going to be moving a little bit faster than the moisture that's located in the upper levels, which means that for the duration of its life, it should have a very asymmetrical look to it, which will keep it at bay from really intensifying much more than a strong tropical storm or a low-end hurricane, which is certainly good news for the Leeward Islands. However, you can't underestimate this storm either, because this could still bring a heavy amount of flooding, especially in the higher elevations, and damaging winds, which could bring power outages over many areas of the Leeward Islands, as well as even extending as far west as Puerto Rico. But in terms of the composition, it does have a decent amount of convective activity. We are seeing some rotation around the center circulation, so it now could be considered a tropical storm. However, what's interesting is that it's dealing with stronger upper level winds along the northern side, which again is keeping the storm asymmetrical, which is certainly good news. That will keep it from really strengthening into much more than a Category 1 hurricane, but you still need to prepare for major impacts right over the Leeward Islands as well as Puerto Rico. Taking a look at the current wind shear map, we clearly see the winds, the upper level winds on the northern side are much stronger than the winds, the wind shear right over the center of circulation, which is definitely helping at least keep this storm from rapidly intensifying. So now I could confidently say that the trajectory as well as strength forecast of Tropical Storm Tammy is high at this point, with now the European model leaning more towards what the GFS model been stating over the past several days. Taking a look at the latest run of the European model does expect this storm system to intensify. However, I'll still say that the European model is definitely underestimating the strength of this storm system as it approaches the Leeward Islands, because it likely will become a stronger storm than this, especially since the GFS model overall has been having a better handle with this storm system. So it makes me believe that the GFS model is the computer model you want to lean a little bit more towards when it comes to the trajectory and strength. In the European model's case, however, in terms of trajectory, very similar track forecast. It's coming uncomfortably close to Leeward Islands, potentially making a landfall along one of the islands, and we do see the heavy rainfall moves over this area, where the Leeward Islands should expect anywhere from 2 to 4 inches of rain, which is enough to cause flash flooding in localized areas. And for Puerto Rico, the good news is that the European model does expect the worst of the rain to stay off the coast, maybe isolated showers, but not really much to worry about in this scenario. Just of course worry about rough surf as well as a high rip current risk along the northern coast of Puerto Rico. But outside of that, in this scenario, the European model would take this storm just enough off the coast to where Puerto Rico wouldn't experience significant impacts, but much of the eastern Leeward Islands would experience very significant impacts when it comes to wind and heavy rainfall. Take a look at what the GFS model is stating. This is a computer model I do believe will be the more accurate one, especially since the National Hurricane Center has been agreeing with the GFS model a little bit more. We do see a much stronger storm. Its millibar pressure is hovering around 990 millibars, and moving forward into the more long-term future, it becomes an even more intense storm, where we see this pressure dropped down to major hurricane status type pressure. But the good news is that, of course, this will be well to the north of the Caribbean, so you wouldn't experience at least the worst of the storm when it comes to its intensity. But the Leeward Islands would still experience anywhere from 2 to 4 inches of rain, as well as gustier winds in excess of 50 to 70 mile per hour wind gusts around the Leeward Islands. And I do expect the trajectory to be even a little bit further westward than this, since the National Hurricane Center and the Ensemble members have been in higher agreement that it is going to move westward compared to what the GFS model is currently stating. So I am expecting a strong tropical storm to potentially low-end hurricane landfall right over the Leeward Islands. Here are what the Ensemble members are stating, and we clearly see why the National Hurricane Center is leading towards a trajectory a little bit further westward. It's due to the fact that the Ensemble members have been very persistent on bringing this storm a little bit further westward and taking landfall somewhere over the Leeward Islands. And we even have some taking it as far west as Puerto Rico. So Puerto Rico, you might not be out of the woods just yet when it comes to a landfall. I'll still say the most likely scenario is that it'll move just to the east of the island, but you could still experience significant impacts from this storm system depending on where exactly, when exactly it takes that northward turn, which still has yet to be seen. Like I've been saying in my previous videos, the position of this ridge just to the north of it will play a key role in determining when it takes that track further northward. The stronger the ridge, the more likely it's going to take a south. It's going to take a northern track a little bit later in the run, which means that this would move over the Leeward Islands and potentially as far west as Puerto Rico before eventually turning northward, which would of course bring much more impacts to the Leeward Islands as well as Puerto Rico. So we're going to stay tuned with how strong this ridge will be over the next few hours to determine the exact trajectory. But Puerto Rico, just be aware of the possibility of a potential landfall, or at least a storm system that will move close enough to bring you potentially significant impacts if this ridge ends up being strong enough. So definitely pay close attention to this ridge as well as this trough, because the more powerful this trough ends up being, the more likely we're going to see a weaker ridge to steer this northward a little bit earlier to avoid the worst of the impacts of lesser and for the Lesser Antilles as well as Puerto Rico. In terms of the model intensity guidance, we do see a majority of them do believe that this will stay tropical storm status, with a couple of them wanting to take this to hurricane status. I definitely wouldn't rule out the possibility this does strengthen into category 1, especially in the more long-term future. In fact, I would expect this to reach at least low-end hurricane status, maybe around 75 to 80 miles per hour, and it could happen potentially just before it impacts the Lesser Antilles. So the Lesser Antilles, you need to be aware, you need to prepare as if a hurricane is approaching you guys, because it's going to bring hurricane-like impacts, even if this necessarily won't be considered a hurricane when it comes to wind speed. It's going to be close enough to a point where the impacts won't really change that much, whether it's a 70 mile per hour tropical storm or a 75 mile per hour hurricane. It still would bring significant impacts when it comes to heavy rain as well as gusty winds. And here's the National Hurricane Center's forecast when it comes to tropical storm Tammy. So National Hurricane Center isn't expecting this to strengthen into hurricane status, at least as of right now. I definitely wouldn't be surprised if we do see an update with the forecast cone where the National Hurricane Center expects this to eventually strengthen into hurricane status, especially with the GFS model being as persistent as it is in developing this into a hurricane eventually. So definitely don't be surprised if we do see the forecast shift to where the National Hurricane Center strengthened this into a hurricane. But whether it does or not, this still is expected to be a strong tropical storm as it approaches Leeward Islands, where the wind speed should hover around 65 to 70 miles per hour by the time it makes landfall over one of the islands. So you need to prepare as if a hurricane is approaching you guys, like I said. And in preparation of this storm, of course, we are seeing now tropical storm watches be issued over some of the Leeward Islands, and expect the tropical storm watches and warnings to expand even further northward once we approach closer and closer to the Saturday time frame, which is the time period when Tropical Storm Tammy or potentially Hurricane Tammy impacts the Lesser Antilles, which is pretty much guaranteed at this point. And look at the forecast going. I want to go in detail with this a little bit more. This storm could still take a track that's very far to the west, and that would still bring significant impacts to Puerto Rico, which is why I say Puerto Rico, you're not out of the woods just yet. You need to pay close attention to this over the next few days, especially once we approach a Friday time frame, to really determine if this will bring impacts to you guys, because there's still very well that possibility. It could take a track a little bit further westward and bring heavier rainfall as well as gusty winds if it were to take that trajectory. So you want to pay close attention to that. And then beyond the Lesser Antilles, the good news is that it's looking like it'll move out to sea. Not even necessarily bringing direct impacts to Bermuda, but the forecast is subject to change in the more long-term future. So Bermuda, you at least might want to be aware of this in the more long-term future. So here's the probability each area of the Lesser Antilles will experience tropical storm force impacts. Right now, a large portion of the the Leeward Islands should experience over a 40% chance of tropical storm force winds, which pretty much is defined as a 1 minute period where the sustained winds are over 39 miles per hour. I do expect the chance to increase once we approach closer and closer to the weekend. Once the forecast does become more certain, you should expect tropical storm force impacts at any given time, where the wind speed should hover over 40 miles per hour sustained for at least 1 minute. And I wouldn't be surprised if you do experience wind gusts well over 70 miles per hour, which is enough to cause power outages, trees down. So make sure to bring those loose things inside right over the Leeward Islands. And we could even see tropical storm force impacts right over Puerto Rico as well. And here's the forecasted rainfall from the European model. The good news is that the storm system will be asymmetrical enough to where most of the moisture will be located on the eastern half of this storm system. So if you're going to be on the western side of the eye, chances are you won't experience that much rainfall. But in the European model's case, we do see a large area of the Lesser Antilles or the Leeward Islands experience around 1 to 2 inches of rain. But I do expect the rainfall forecast to be higher than this, because the computer models right now are forecasting the track to be a little bit too far east than the general consensus. So I do expect the rainfall to be more so right around 2 to 5 inches right over Lesser Antilles. And of course, in the more localized areas such as the higher elevations, you could experience rainfall even higher than that, which is enough to cause flash flooding as well as just regular river flooding. So you definitely need to pay close attention, especially if you live in poor drainage areas and other areas that are very vulnerable to flooding during events like this. So the Lesser Antilles, definitely pay very close attention to this. Another concern you should have, especially if you live right up along the coast of the Leeward Islands and Puerto Rico, is the wave heights and the potential for coastal flooding in the more vulnerable areas. Take a look at the wave height forecast. You should expect potentially 10 to 15 footers right over right along the coast of the Leeward Islands, which is enough to cause coastal flooding in the more vulnerable areas. Of course, stay out of the water. The rip current risk should be very high. Let me go a little bit further back into the forecast. We do see that the wave height should be quite strong right up along the northern coast of Puerto Rico, even extending into the Leeward Islands, and even as far west as the northern coast of the Dominican Republic. The wave height should be pretty high as we approach the weekend and into early next week, thanks to tropical storm or potentially Hurricane Tammy moving over the northern Atlantic. So you want to be aware of the rip current risk. Remember if there is a high rip current risk in your specific location, you definitely don't want to risk going into the water, because unfortunately, one of the leading causes of weather-related deaths in the United States is due to rip currents, and it's unfortunate because you could easily just avoid it. Just make sure to stay out of the water. You definitely don't want to risk going into water that's very life-threatening. So you make sure to definitely take the right precautions right up along the coast. But that's it for now, guys. Thank you guys for watching. Make sure to stay safe right over the Leeward Islands as Tropical Storm Tammy approaches and even extending as far west as Puerto Rico. This should bring very significant impacts. Remember, if you see a body of floodwaters, turn around, don't drown, because typically the floodwaters are a lot deeper than what you'd expect. So make sure to take the necessary precautions as Tropical Storm Tammy approaches you guys. But I hope you guys all have a great day.